Hello, friends, and welcome to Home is Where the Body Is. I'm Jen, an ADHD woman with EDS, POTS, complex PTSD, and OCD, shaped by an abusive religious upbringing. I spent much of my life feeling like I was balancing precariously over an endless pit, constantly reaching for a stable home that always seemed just out of reach. Today, I can honestly say that home is wherever I am right now, built on the stable ground that's growing out of a deepening relationship with my body and myself. In this podcast, I share the lived experiences that brought me here, in case it helps someone feel less alone or supports them on their own journey home. Today, I'd like to talk about the very understandable desire that a lot of us have to change others, and how that affected my journey towards making home in my own nervous system. So there was a turning point where I recognized that I cannot change other people, that their behaviors, maturity, or willingness to engage are not mine to control. Letting go of the belief that love requires fixing or reshaping others was a big shift for me. It was a very liberating moment when I finally realized that, immature or unhealthy or not, nobody's behaviors are mine to change. Nobody owes me emotional engagement or a healthy relationship, any more than I owe them a continued relationship under emotionally unsafe conditions. Suddenly, it became quite clear. I actually can't change others, but I can change myself. It was a really important moment for me when I realized the expectation that attachment must be maintained through control was an expectation that I needed to release. Instead of equating love with responsibility for others' behavior, I redirected that focus inward. This replaced anxiety and over responsibility with personal accountability, boundaries, and acceptance of what is outside of my control, namely, the behavior of others. I grew up with that idea of attachment being maintained through control, right? That wasn't something that I just randomly made up. This was something that was taught to me by my upbringing. My parents often expressed their quote, love. I don't know if I would define it as love. That's what they called it. I did not experience it as love, but they expressed it through control. So, I've talked before on this podcast about my high control religious upbringing and my abusive father, who would, fly into rages when he felt like he didn't have control, or I perceived he felt like he didn't have control over me or my mom, especially me. I think he felt that because I was his kid, he should be able to control me. So, what I'm trying to say is that I think a lot of people um, equate kind of attachment with control, especially people with like more anxious leaning attachment styles. But, if you are one of those people, just know y- that's not your fault. Like, you're not some tyrannical partner or friend or whatever who's just trying to control the people you love because you're evil or something. Like, that was probably taught to you. I mean, in the same way, it was probably taught to my parents by their parents, and on and on and on. But you can break the cycle. But for me, I actually kind of thought that I broke the cycle when I broke free externally from the control of my parents. And I say externally because I still had this like internalized idea of love and control being equated. Um, when I broke free externally from the control of my parents and the church that I grew up in, I didn't realize this, of course, at the time, but I think the only way I knew how to love was to control. So I hadn't actually broken free internally. I think there's kind of like a two-stage thing there. In my experience, there's a certain bargain struck in anxiously attached or anxious leaning relationships. And this bargain says if I take issue with something that you do or are, then you owe it to me to change, and vice versa. I would say that well, I hope that I am currently earning a secure attachment. I would say that historically, I was, fearful avoidant because of trauma, but I do think that I tend to lean anxious or have tended to, just because I think I tended to pair up with people who were avoidant, or maybe even sometimes fearful avoidant themselves. But I've read about, again, I'm not an expert on attachment styles or anything. If you want someone who's an expert, I very highly recommend Heidi Priebe on YouTube. But I think it was actually one of her videos that taught me that when two anxious avoidants are in a relationship, they can often polarize each other. Or if you're anxious avoidant and you're with an avoidant, you might get polarized toward the anxious side. So, anyway, I won't go into a digression on attachment styles unless that's something listeners want, but not in this episode. So, um, yes, that's why I am identifying with kind of more anxious leaning relationships in this discussion. So, I ended up in a lot of relationships that were high conflict. And I thought the emotional immaturity and unhealthy conflict habits of the people I dated were mine to change as I saw fit. And by the way, I was not terribly mature or healthy myself. But with that realization, that letting go of a long held expectation that I should be allowed to change the unhealthy or immature, behaviors of a partner, this freed me up to focus on changing myself, changing my own emotionally immature or unhealthy conflict habits because it takes two to tango. If you're in a high conflict relationship, you are contributing to it in some ways as well. It always frustrates me. This is a small digression, but I have been back on the dating apps lately. It really frustrates me when I run into people, and by people, I mostly mean men, but I assume it would happen with women too. I just haven't run into it yet, but it really frustrates me when I run into people on the apps who, when you ask them about, like, oh, what did you learn from your last relationship? Or what does a healthy relationship look like to you? Or whatever. And all they can talk about is how shitty their exes are, right? Or like, oh, I went to therapy after my divorce, and I learned that my ex was just toxic, and I learned to never get taken advantage of again, and I learned about my own value and what I shouldn't tolerate. And I'm like, that's great. What did you learn about how you could be a better partner? What did you learn about how you contributed? And it's just radio silence. That always frustrates me. Um, so I think the point I'm trying to make is there's always something that you can do to improve the way you relate to other people. Maybe I should use first person and say there's always something I can do as well. Always something I can do better. And instead of focusing on how to change partners, I can instead focus on how to step away from unhealthy partners and change, work on myself. Because I think for me, at least, in these relationships where I felt like the way my partner was behaving or approaching conflict or the way they weren't showing up emotionally, etc., when I wasn't happy with what they were doing, and understandably so, like they weren't approaching the relationship or conflict in a healthy, good faith way. But I thought that I that like I could force them to change. And so in that way, I was also continuing the cycle. And I was also approaching things in an unhealthy way because the healthy thing to do in that situation is to leave, to disengage, to say, I have a boundary where I don't remain in relationship with people who, whatever it might be, get defensive constantly during conflict, refuse to ever repair or take accountability, refuse to share their feelings and instead keep them inside until they boil up as resentment and just come screaming out in some big argument or whatever. But I will say that this desperate need for the condition of an attachment bond to be within my control lasted well into adulthood. It has been a long and hard road to learn to let go and to allow bonds to be ruptured by the behavior of others without attempting to force them to repair it. But after this long road, or perhaps I should say more towards the end of this long road, because I don't think any roads or journeys ever truly end. Once I no longer was tying my sense of safety and belonging to others' actions or behavior, I began to internalize stability. Home stopped being something dependent on maintaining or repairing external relationships and became something self generated. This allowed me to disengage from unhealthy dynamics more quickly and invest in environments and connections that genuinely support me, making home a condition I carry rather than one I chase. Right? Stability, like relational stability, can be something that you have with yourself. It doesn't require another person, which is something it took me a really long time to learn. Like, if you are in good standing with yourself and have good relational stability with yourself, it makes it easier to disengage from unhealthy dynamics. Because you can be like, would I treat myself like that? Or I guess you can kind of use your relationship with yourself as sort of a model for like, this is the type of relationship that I want to have with other people. Or at least I have found that helpful for me, to me. Because I spent a large portion of my life being controlled by the people I was supposed to hold most dear, namely my parents and the members of the cult I grew up in. Um, like I previously said about growing up in a high control environment. And again, as I've talked about before, there was very much a clear link between love, fear, and control implanted in my growing neurology. And to expand a little bit more about how we are taught to associate love with control, or like to feel this need, this anxious attachment need to be able to really control an attachment bond and really, like, it's almost like we feel like we need to be able to single-handedly repair it. Like, if the other person won't repair it, at least this is how it's felt for me. I need the assurance that, like, or I have needed in the past, the assurance that if the other person won't repair it, then I can, like, force them to repair it. Which is I now recognize a very unhealthy way of approaching relationships. But we're taught this when young children experience a rupture in the attachment bond with a caregiver, you know, which as a young child, a caregiver is someone on whom they depend for survival. When young children in this situation experience such a rupture, they must assume that it's their fault. For if it's their fault, it is within their power to fix whatever went wrong. And they have to fix what went wrong. They have to repair the bond because that bond is what provides them with food and shelter and getting their physical needs met, even if it doesn't meet their emotional needs as it should. So that's where I learned this need to single handedly be able to repair a relationship. And now that I've done this work of just really recognizing that I can't control other people, not even people who claim to love me, now that I've done this work, I can recognize that it's actually better in the long run as an adult, or when I'm no longer dependent upon my attachment figures for survival. As an adult, I can just detach from a relationship if the other person refuses to repair it. That is much better. It feels much better internally in my nervous system than trying to force a repair with which the other person doesn't want to cooperate. And there may be a lot of reasons for that. It's not necessarily that the person is abusive or mean or doesn't care about you. I mean, those could very well be true. But I've also dated a lot of people or been friends with as well. A lot of people who I think just never learned in the sense that I also never learned until recently. Just never learned that repair is a possibility. That it's possible to be vulnerable with someone else without completely falling apart. It's possible to recognize that you negatively impacted someone without seeing yourself as some horrible bad guy, because you also recognize that you didn't intend to impact them, but you recognize that the impact is what matters to them. So you have to address that as well. So I won't go on a conflict resolution tangent either, again, unless it's something listeners want, and then I'm happy to do so. But for this episode, again, I'm just focusing on this realization that I really can't control others and how that has definitely helped me make home in my own body and in my own nervous system. And I will say that, as with a lot of things in this podcast, it's more than a cognitive knowing. Like, I feel like I've cognitively known for a long time, oh, I can't force other people to change, but it took an extra long time for me to recognize that internally, as like an internal nervous system realization that, like, wow, I just feel it in my body that I just really can't change others. So I often find that there's like a first cognitive recognizing, but then my nervous system has to learn the lesson as well. So I also just want to note, I also learned this, I believe, in a Heidi Pre video, um, that unhealthy conflict resolution, and I would put like resolution in quotes because it's not really resolution. It's when you need the other person to regulate you for you. So, like, I have a lot of experience with, there's a rupture. This is usually in a romantic relationship. The other person is like, oh, well, I didn't mean to hurt you, so, like, I don't have to apologize, or whatever, or they get defensive, whatever it is. So there's no repair happening from their end. They just want to move on like it didn't happen. And, quote, resolution for me often meant conflict, quote, resolution was okay, well, I can't regulate without that person. In order to feel regulated, I need this attachment bond to be whole. So I am going to go in and do whatever I need to do to resolve, quote, resolve the conflict, right? Either be like, oh, okay, I guess it didn't matter. It's fine, forget it. Or just like insist, and like bully them into saying, like, okay, fine, I'm sorry. Which we all know that doesn't feel satisfying. That's not real repair, which is why I kind of put it in quotes. But real healthy conflict resolution happens when you approach the conflict in a regulated state. But that requires you to be able to regulate without the other person. Like, co regulation is a very nice and wonderful experience. I haven't experienced it very much outside of therapy and probably like one close friendship, but it's really a nice and wonderful experience. It's a good tool to have in your toolbox, but it really, and I'm speaking to myself here, shouldn't be your only tool. Self regulation is very important. And the need, when like the need to be regulated gets outsourced to a relationship, that's when the relationship then becomes about survival. That's when it gets entangled back into these old survival dynamics of I need this attachment bond to be whole in order to survive. As a child, it was because I need them to provide me with food and shelter, whatever. But when you carry it into adulthood this way, it becomes because I need that other person to regulate me, because I don't know how to regulate myself. So, anyway, hope that wasn't too long of a tangent. I realized I went on that tangent after saying that I wouldn't go on a conflict resolution tangent, but that was something that has been really important, an important part of my realization, and has featured very prominently in my experience. So I figured I would mention that. Because of course, you can't feel at home in your own body and nervous system if you can't regulate your own nervous system. Like, of course that's not going to feel like home. And of course you're going to feel like you have to change other people in order to get them to regulate you. Because that is ultimately what this whole concept in this whole episode is about. Is like, not just I can't change other people, but I can't change other people to make them regulate me for me, ultimately. And now, I waste a lot less time on relationships, romantic or otherwise, that were never going to serve me in the first place. As we come to the end of this episode, I want to thank you for spending this time with me. If anything in this episode resonated with you and you'd like to share a thought, reflection, or bit of feedback, you're very welcome to email me. And if this podcast feels supportive or meaningful to you, I'd appreciate it if you left an honest review or shared it with someone who might also find it helpful. That's how this work finds the people that it's meant for. You've been listening to Home is Where the Body Is. I'm Jen, and I wish you a safe journey home.